And in this room, again, we've mixed the European and American works to, again, speak to what different artists were doing, you know, during, primarily in many cases, the 60s and 70s. A lot of this work comes from that era into the early 80s. And of course, the classic example is, in terms of object making, is the very formal Donald Judd stack sculpture, which is his most recognizable image. Very formal, very man-made, very machine-made, if you will. Very much about the grid, very much about everything being perfect, which in a sense is a perfect metaphor for the house. The house is about being perfect in terms of construction and form and shape, and that everything lines up in a way that gives a great sense of completeness. And then you have this wonderful work by the Italian artist Giulio Paolini, where you have the classical figures presented as two busts looking at each other with their fallen comrade, that they're sort of looking at with a sense, we don't know if it's a sense of wantonness or a sense of absence and loss. We're not quite sure. Again, one of the major influences of our collection is in post-war Italian art, and we discovered this to a degree, you know, in exploring what was going on in Europe after World War II. There was a sense that everything that was, all art after, you know, World War II really came from New York, came from the New York school, whereas in the early part of the 20th century, it was all about the School of Paris. That was the center of the art world, the art universe. That universe essentially was shattered by the war and became reintroduced with the power of abstract expressionism in New York. And the whole notion that everything of consequence was sort of American-made, if you will, was a myth that really prevailed in this country for a long time. It really wasn't until really the early 80s that at a big exhibition documented in 1982, a big exhibition in Germany, where Americans actually saw the product of what was being made in Europe by the great European artists of the time. It was in 1982, was sort of this pivotal moment in this sort of what we would call revisionist history of art history. And what we have done is gone back and explored a lot of the European side of things being done after the war, and how that work interspersed and intertwined with what they knew about American work and how it fit within you know, the thinking of the time, and how it, quite frankly, lives today and resonates today in quite an interesting way. Needless to say, after the 80s and this sort of discovery, the art world has become so pluralistic that we don't talk about the works of Italy or the works of New York or the works of China. It's more global. It's all international, and it's become intertwined because of the influences of the artist. You couldn't necessarily say that this was made by an Italian, you know, and this was made by an American. It no longer resonates that way. But at the time, there was a clear sense in terms of how they approached materials and the way the works were created that influenced the artists in their thought process. And we're in essence trying to re-explore and reintroduce that to an audience in this country to at least reflect on art making in our time a little bit differently. A classic example is this painting by Janis Kanellis, an Italian artist of Greek descent, who stitched this canvas with the words lunedì, martedì, mercoledì, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, on this canvas, which in fact has been stitched together and is taking this relatively primitive material in this relatively primitive way, painting it with a hint of popism, if there's such a word. It's from 1963. And the idea of using text as art, and the idea of these sort of unusual colors and this sort of almost popish-like experience, dramatically different from any kind of work being made in America at that point in time. It's a radical look, and he was one of the principal artists of this movement was named by the art critic Germano Chalant, who called it arte povera, poor art, if you will. And it didn't just mean poor materials, it meant more natural and looking at art from a very personal and human standpoint, if you will. This is one of the more significant works in the collection. And then we swing around looking at two works that are of great interest to us, particularly, that two German artists. The painting in the background by Anselm Kiefer, again from 1983, one of those artists who was discovered at that moment to be making serious work. And this title of this work is To the Unknown Painter, and it's really this sort of palette with the brush just sort of coming up in the middle of this very, what in fact is Nazi-like architecture, and it's like the role of the artist, you know, in society after the fracturing of the world in World War II. Is really a lot of what this reference is about. And there's some who would argue, in fact, as we talked before, the idea of art can be what you think it is, reference back to the fact that Hitler was a painter, a house painter, if you will, but imagined himself also as an artist of form. And is this sort of a subtle postmodern homage or reference back to Hitler in the form of architecture that's relevant? It's almost a monument to one side of him. I would argue that Kiefer's primary purpose was in trying to get the German people to continue to deal with this guilt, this whole period of history that at the time was not so historical. It was much more, you know, in their face. And how do you make artwork that has integrity and responds to the great tragedy that World War II was really about? And in a way, Issa Genskin, a German sculptor, made this work also in the 80s, using, again, the very simple materials, as opposed to the very formal of Donald Judd, the very, you know, broken shards of rocks that really are formed in this sort of almost enclosed way, monumentalized on this pedestal, in a sense, giving a sense of honor to this, you know, not so complete, but what's left of arguably a building or some part of history that has sort of been remanipulated, if you will. But again, a very profound and interesting work of art.
Yes, and interesting that both of them, too, have little traces of red going in them in the center there and over there. So again, you think about the past.
Yes, exactly.
And the destruction of life.
Exactly. And again, it's all about each interpretation.
Yes.
And again, presented in this architecture, you know, you have architecture that's formal, and then you have this architecture that's also formal.
Yes.
So it's presented in quite a good way.
Yes.
So we'll continue?
All right, please.